Welcome to Influential Entrepreneurs, bringing you interviews with elite business leaders and experts, sharing tips and strategies for elevating your business to the next level. Here's your host, Mike Saunders.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Influential Entrepreneurs. This is Mike Saunders, the Authority Positioning Coach, and today we have with us Christian Muntean, who is the author of The Successful New CEO. Christian, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mike. It's good to be here.
Hey, so I want to learn about the book and what drove you to write it, and what the focus is, and what people will learn from it. Because I love the way it's laid out. Of course, everyone wants to be successful, but the new CEO. So this isn't about the old successful CEOs and how you can be more successful. This is, hey, you might just have become a new CEO. Let's help you accelerate your learning curve. And so I'm excited to learn about that. But tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to write the book.
Sure. Well, I'm a organizational development consultant, and I mean, the better way of saying that, I guess, is I work with leaders and organizations to really help them produce the results that they've been looking for. And many times, right now, if you look at the market for businesses, 75%, the statistics are 75% of all businesses right now are owned by baby boomers, and they're planning on being out the next couple of years. And so there's a massive shift in leadership in this country that's taking place. And most organizations are pretty unprepared for this. So this dynamic of how do we get new leadership in? How do we get new executive leadership in? How do we get new CEOs in place is just becoming huge. And so it's a lot of the work that I do is working on both sides of that, helping somebody prepare for an exit, and then helping either a successor or somebody step into a new hire, step into that CEO position. And that's what drove it. Is I found myself in this space so frequently, working as a coach or a consultant. And one of the dynamics that you see is that, I mean, let's say it's an internal hire or placement. Somebody used to be the COO or CFO, for example. And they feel pretty confident. They understand the organization. They've been there for a long time. They understand executive roles. But when they get to the pointy part of the pyramid, all of a sudden there's a dynamic there that they didn't anticipate or expect, that they don't have all of the freedom necessarily if they're serving under a board to do everything that they wanted to do. But also the buck stops with them in a way that it didn't before. And I find that many of them struggle with knowing how to really effectively step into their first year and make the most out of that opportunity.
You know, that's a really good point, because it reminds me of like if you were looking to buy a different home and it's a bigger home and you think, I can afford it. Look, we ran the mortgage payment, and you didn't realize, after running the mortgage payment, yeah, we can afford the payment, but now the property taxes are higher, the utilities are going to be higher. There's an HO, so there's all those other things. So I think what you were just mentioning, you might be a CEO and think, Yahoo, I got the job, but there's some nuances that you might not on the first, pass through think of. And what are those going to be? How do you react to them? That's a really, really good point.
Absolutely. I love that analogy. I'll probably end up stealing that.
Swipe and adapt. It's not stealing. It's swiping and adapt. It's really, but that's really an apt analogy, because that is what happens. You have this great opportunity. You're like, wow, I just got into the dream home. We've priced it out according to what the lender said. And I just really didn't think about all the additional time it takes to take care of it and all these things or whatever. But it is a different dynamic than what people anticipate, even if they've been looking at it and watching it and talking to the CEO for a long time. And so now many of the principles for what makes an effective new CEO are also relevant for well-established old CEOs. But there are some dynamics about how do you enter an organization, particularly if you're coming from the outside, or if you're coming from the inside and now you're no longer a peer on the executive team, but you're the boss or the employer. Yeah. That shift, that is one of those unanticipated changes that many people aren't sure how to navigate effectively.
Well, I want to ask you about a few of those shifts, but it makes me think of something to set the stage before we get into that. And this is probably something you talk about in the book, but from me, from the outside, listening in and looking in, isn't there a difference between when we think of new CEO? You initially might think, you were a CFO or you were a VP of whatever, and now you got tapped to be CEO. Wow, that's a whole new world. You need to learn this and know this and adapt to this as a new to the role. But isn't there another nuance where you might be an experienced CEO but coming into a new organization, new company, and now you're having to take your CEO skills and mold and adapt to not only maybe the new industry, but a new team of people too.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And you do see that dynamic as well, particularly if somebody has spent, let's say their career in one industry or one organization, and now they're switching. And the first example that just popped to mind, and it's not the only one out there, is somebody who's had a real successful military career. They're retiring out, 20, 25 years in the military, high-ranking officer position, lots of experience and really good training. And then they find that they're working in an organization that just doesn't have, even though the military doesn't, good leadership training in the military doesn't base itself on the command and control dynamic. Any bad leader in the military can always fall back on that.
Yeah.
And so many leaders in that context will come into a new context and feel like, I should be able to just nail it here because, this is a simpler, smaller thing. There's no war or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then you realize I can't just make people do things in the same way. And that's just one example.
I think it's excellent because I really think I love looking at something that people think initially, it's this, but then looking at it from another perspective. So new CEO might be brand new to the role, but it also might be an experienced CEO coming into a new organization, and you might need to learn the exact same things you're teaching, even though you've been a CEO for a decade. So let's get into that. What are some of the things you teach in your book that CEOs need to be aware of?
Well, I break it into a couple of themes or chunks. And so one is just looking at the person, like who you are as a leader, and reevaluating that. And so most people move into leadership roles because they're technically proficient at something. They're good at something. Or if they came up through, certain context, it has a lot to do with just longevity and being on the, being around a long time. Seniority gets you those leadership positions. And so becoming effective as a leader, because if you're the CEO, you now have this responsibility for the culture of the organization in a way that many people don't fully appreciate. And so helping people understand what's the difference between managing and now really stepping into this leadership dynamic. And leadership is always a reflection of who you are as a person. I mean, your tool for leadership is yourself. And so I always tell my clients that personal development is leadership development. And so that's for a chunk of the book is just who do you need to be as a person to really be effective as an executive or a CEO. And then I also look at some of the key skills that a leader needs to have, just the basic key skills that you need to have as a CEO that maybe haven't stood out to you or you've not developed in a different role, even like another executive role. And then another section has to do with just the first things. How do you enter an organization? What are the first things that you should do as you step into an organization that will help create or engender the success that you're looking for?
I think that a lot of times we learn from people's mistakes. That's an old cliche. Well, what I would wonder is when someone is going to read, let's say that they read your book in one weekend, just start to finish. Sure. What is one or two points that they're going to come away with that would surprise them? Because I feel like someone would go, all right, I got the gist of this, but I'm going to read this book anyway. What are a couple things that's going to surprise them? Like, no, that's a good point.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what would really, I cover a lot of ground, so it'll probably be different for different people. But what I think probably the main point that will surprise a lot of people, and it's something I keep coming back to, is that leadership is really about who you are as a person. And so I explore that from multiple angles. But if you're dealing with motivation in other people, if you're dealing with your ability to create alignment culturally and organizationally and operationally, if you're dealing with your ability to provide accountability and to get things done or deal with conflict or any of those topics, it all comes back to who are you as a person. And I think that is the surprise for a lot of people. I mean, it's not totally surprising, but I think it just brings you back to this grounding place of, oh, I need to be a certain kind of somebody to be effective in this role. So how do I grow into that?
And it follows along with the old saying, walk your talk.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And how do you evaluate where I'm at or who I am right now and the results that I'm getting? What's the relationship between those two things?
Yeah. And I know I don't know who this is attributed to. I want to say Peter Drucker, but you can correct me because I'm sure you'll recognize this quote. But it's from back in the 70s or 80s. Manage by walking around.
I recognize the quote, and I don't recall who.
Okay, so now the name is coming to me. Tom Peters. Whoever said it. It's so insightful because you can just envision a leader being up in their ivory tower office and barking out orders or emailing this and being so removed from the organization that people are just like, I don't even know that I respect him. He or she is not part of us. But the manage by walking around is, number one, engaging with your people. Number two, seeing firsthand, like if you're walking around the cubicles, walking around the manufacturing floor, you are seeing and hearing maybe real-time issues and opportunities. Is that something that you see in your work with clients?
I do see that there is it's important for leaders to have a real life sense of what's going on. In fact, in strategic planning, I'll often ask or sometimes insist on administrative assistants being involved in strategic planning processes because they often are the only ones who really know what's happening. They're at the nexus point of information flowing in and out. And, most executives resist that, but then when they show up in the meeting, they tend to have that, well, here's how this really works out on the ground perspective, which is important. And if executives are not getting that in some way, then they're operating somewhat blindly. But there's another kind of a play off of that too, which might be interesting to some readers, which I learned years ago that I could learn a lot about executives, particularly the CEO, in very highly layered organizations without ever meeting that person, just by meeting frontline staff. Because the impact of culture and who the leader is and how they shape culture and how their values and preferences, whether they're ever articulated on a website or a bumper sticker or not, they shape the way other people behave and act in an organization. And I found that if I visit a couple of different departments in an organization or stores or whatever it is, and I'm even just talking to frontline staff at many, 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 many layers up above, I'll have found echoes of that CEO and that executive team in how their staff acts, the values that they have, and the decisions that they make. And I'll see similarities, and it's become a great evaluation tool for me before I even meet an executive, is to just spend time with their front-level staff and see, well, what messaging seems to be coming through here? What's the experience here? What might that tell me? And I have to proof test this. I can't jump to conclusions. But I have found consistently that if there's an avoidance of conflict and lack of accountability amongst frontline staff, you'll find that on the executive team.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. You mentioned a few minutes ago secession. So I can imagine that you may be working with a CEO that's planning on moving on, and he's planning on long enough ahead that you can work with him or her and their team, as well as now the baton passes to the new person, and you're then transitioning right to working with the new person coming in. So what does that look like?
Could you clarify, like, what does the working with both? I'm not sure that I understand the question.
Yeah, working with both sides of the outgoing CEO and the incoming CEO in the same organization.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, that's pretty common. And so oftentimes I try to it depends on the dynamics. You know, if you're dealing with a family-owned company, you have a different dynamic than if you have someone where a board is hiring somebody from outside. And there's lots of different ways that you structure it. What I try to do is I evaluate the dynamic that will best serve the interest of the organization and the people involved and help them essentially choreograph that dance so that the handover is as smooth as possible. Back in high school, I used to run relays in track and field. And so you win a relay not with having the fastest sprinters, but really with whoever does the smoothest handoff. And that's something that I really help with the succession is you want to have fast sprinters. You want to have, you know, your ace people on the team. But in terms of the succession really being the best experience for everyone, I just help them choreograph that. And that just honestly, it changes from organization to organization depending on what they need. I would say most outgoing leaders serve themselves and others well if they give themselves at least a year, if not a few years, to prepare. And then, but I like to have, and by preparing, I mean, you know, I mean, the whole country switches its executive leadership within, you know, between November and January of every 4 years or every 8 years. So you can do it faster. But, you know, many executives have projects they want to wrap up. They have people they want to bring up into a position and so on. And so I just like to encourage people that they give themselves time to do that. And then for the leader coming in, it's really effective for them to have a little bit of coaching as they onboard and then at least a solid year or so of coaching as they get going or some kind of support so that they can be effective in stepping in. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, totally. In other words, it would in a perfect world, it would be wonderful if an outgoing CEO would know enough time, 6 months to a year, to go, I'm moving on. Let's make sure that everything's in place. But I'm sure that's only a small percentage of the time. So what do you do when it's kind of like your hair's on fire and you're sprinting and it's like, uh-oh, the CEO resigned and he's given us, 30 days. How do you compress some of that good advice and planning from what could be a year down to a month and still getting some good results for the outgoing as well as incoming CEO?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And then not to make it overly complex, it depends on if there's a board involved or, you know, partners or and how they're engaged in the whole process. But really, probably the most simple answer is, and it depends, I should back up, it also depends if there's already someone else identified to fill in that role or if there needs to be some kind of interim or the executive team's carrying things or whatever. What I tend to do in any of these highly unstable situations is work with the organization to help them really strip away all of the different priorities and demands and senses of urgency that exist and help them really identify what are the core goals that we need to have that will bring us to the place of stability and help us get back on track to pursuing our vision. But while things are unstable, how do we create stability right now, just for the organization and for our people? And so that's the first thing that I'll do. And then depending on all of the specifics surrounding the situation, we start figuring out how do we get because the danger that can be in that dynamic, which frequently happens, is you get, you know, kind of a warm body hire, kind of who's closest and nearest that can fill this position because we're scared. And then oftentimes you get someone that you have to get rid of or they just don't function well for a long time. So making sure that they make a good decision in that space as well.
Yes, and those decisions are based on previous decisions in hiring and knowing the corporate culture. And, you know, all you can do is make that educated hire. And so many times you have to watch for specific qualities and knowing what the corporate culture is. And so I'm sure that has got so many nuances. So I'm really pleased that you put together this book, because being able to have a new CEO new to the position or a CEO new to the organization, this will be a wonderful resource for them. So what is the best way that someone can pick up a copy and reach out and connect with you?
Yeah, the easiest way for them to get a copy of the book is to just go on Amazon.com, and it's the Successful New CEO. It'll be available on Barnes & Noble and kind of pushed out everywhere, so it should be easy to find if you just search the title. In terms of reaching me, my website's the best way. It's www.christianmuntean, Muntean, and my first name spelled just like the word, so christianmuntean.com. And that's the best way to get a hold of me is through my website.
Excellent. Well, Christian, thank you so much for coming on today. It was really good getting to know you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Influential Entrepreneurs with Mike Saunders. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show or listen to past episodes, visit www.influentialentrepreneurssradio.com.